Hello, my dear listeners. Hello, my dear friends. How are you all? I hope you are doing your best with honesty to serve your duty to the fullest. With this good wish, let's start the next part from the life of Sri Ramakrishna Paramhansa Dev, and today we are going to investigate why Brambhani, Bhairavi Brambhani was assigned to him by divine. So let's start. A few days after, another symptom of a different kind but no less troublesome made its appearance. Sri Ramakrishna himself described it thus: I was seized with a ravenous appetite which no amount of food could satisfy. No sooner had I taken something than I again felt hungry. Day and night, one thought alone possessed my mind, and that was what to eat. What may this new disease be? I anxiously thought. When I consulted the Brahmani, she replied, my son, don't worry. Those who advance on the path of spirituality pass through such abnormal states. Wait, I shall cure it. She asked Mathur to store in a room a large quantity of edibles of all sorts. When it was done, she told me to remain in that room day and night and eat whenever and whatever I liked. I did so, moving about and taking every now and then a bit of something or other according to fancy. After 3 days, I was cured. This sort of appetite has been recorded in the lives of other aspirants. Sri Ramakrishna experienced this abnormal craving for food several times in his life. These successful experiments, the strange coincidence of the various realizations of Sri Ramakrishna with the recorded evidence of the scriptures, and the wonderful experience she had on the very first day of her meeting, left no doubt whatsoever in the mind of the Brahmani as to the truth of her bold hypothesis about the Master's real personality. Now, she openly asserted that Sri Ramakrishna was not an ordinary devotee, nor even a superman with lofty spiritual realization, but that he was an incarnation of God born into this world for some inscrutable purpose. When she was convinced that her conclusions were correct, she began to speak of them freely not only to Sri Ramakrishna and Hriday but to many others. One day, Sri Ramakrishna was seated with Hriday and Mathur in the Panchavati when he casually remarked to the latter, you see, a Brahmin lady has come here. She calls me an incarnation of God. How can that be? Replied Mathur. Since the scriptures mention only 10 incarnations and there is no room for an 11th one, but I admit you have obtained the grace of the Mother Kali. She says she finds the distinguishing marks of an incarnation on my body and in my mind, said the Master. She is well versed in the scriptures and she has also a lot of books with her. They were talking thus when they saw the Brahmani approaching with a plate of sweetmeats. Mathur asked the master if she were the one of whom he had been speaking. Sri Ramakrishna nodded in reply. Mathur found her in a half abstracted mood, as Yashoda used to be when feeding her darling. As she drew near, she saw Mathur, and controlling her emotions with some effort, gave the plate to Hriday. Pointing to Mathur, the master said to the Brahmani, I was just telling him of what you say about me. But he says that the scriptures mention only 10 incarnations and no more. Mathur bowed to her and awaited an answer. Why? She quickly replied. The Bhagavata actually records 22 and then makes room for an infinite number of them. Besides, it is clearly mentioned in the Vaishnava scriptures that Sri Gauranga would be incarnated again, and there is a striking resemblance in many points between him and Sri Ramakrishna. She added that a Vaishnava scholar would settle the point and that she was prepared to prove her case. Mathur remained silent. The Brahmani's bold declaration made a profound impression in the Kali temple. The man who had hitherto been looked upon as a lunatic was emphatically declared to be an incarnation of God, and the scriptures supported this contention. The very man who had been ridiculed and slighted by everybody was being ranked with Sri Krishna, Ramchandra, or Buddha. He became the burning topic of the hour. Mathur was puzzled, torn between faith and doubt. He found himself in a dilemma. From his own experiences with Sri Ramakrishna during the past few years, he had to admit that he possessed many superhuman traits. But he was not ready to think of him as God himself. So, the momentous declaration of the Brahmani raised a storm in his mind. Besides her disinterestedness, which was in her favor, the Brahmani was ready to verify her statement by scriptural authority. She had sent out a challenge. She was prepared to meet any scholar to prove her contention. Sri Ramakrishna, like a boy, was eager to have the meeting, partly to satisfy his own curiosity and to settle his own doubts, and partly to humor Sri Ramakrishna as well as to convince him of his eccentricities. Mathur consented to invite some of the scholars of the day to the garden of Dakshineshwar to taste the soundness of the Brahmani's contention. It was decided to invite Vaishnav Charan and Gauri, two famous scholars. A great devotee, Vaishnav Charan, at that time was one of the leaders of his society and adept in various philosophies and scriptures, especially in books on devotion. A real sadhaka, he was eagerly sought by the people of his sect for advice in their respective paths of sadhana. By inviting him, Mathur had chosen the right man. And Gauri too was preeminently fitted for the task he was called upon to perform. In a few days, Vaishnav Charan arrived at Dakshineshwar with other scholars and devotees, and a small meeting was held in which the Brahmani, Mathur, and Sri Ramakrishna were present. Addressing the Pandits, the Brahmani explained to them what she had heard about Sri Ramakrishna's spiritual practices and what she herself had observed, the conclusions of the scriptures on this point, and lastly, what she thought about the real nature of Sri Ramakrishna. Turning to Vaishnav Charan, she said, "This is my honest conviction about this God man based on the interpretation of certain facts according to the scriptures. I really believe him to be an incarnation of God. Now, please state your reasons if you differ from me." Like a heroic mother, she held herself in readiness to answer all objections. And what about the man around whom this discussion pivoted? Sitting in the midst of that assembly, he looked like a boy perfectly indifferent to the verdict, as if it did not concern him at all. We can picture him sitting at ease, immersed in his own blissful thoughts, sometimes smiling, sometimes talking, sometimes taking a pinch of spices from a pouch, or again saying to Vaishnav Charan, "Look here, sometimes I feel like this or that." The result of the meeting was that Vaishnav Charan subscribed heartily to all the conclusions of the Brahmani. Further, he asserted that the supreme devotion known as the Mahabhava seemed fully manifest in Sri Ramakrishna. It was really wonderful, he added, that while in certain extraordinary cases only a few of its divine characteristics had been noticeable in Sri Ramakrishna, all of them seemed to be fully manifest. Mathur and others were struck dumb at this bold assertion of Vaishnav Charan. Sri Ramakrishna, like a boy, said to Mathur, To think that he should say so. It pleases me to learn that, after all, it is not disease. That Vaishnav Charan did not say these things out of mere sentiment was proved by his attitude towards Sri Ramakrishna. With every day of their acquaintance, his regard and esteem for the master deepened. He became a frequent visitor to the Kali temple of Dakshineshwar, where he sought the advice and guidance of the master in spiritual matters. He occasionally invited other devotees of his order to accompany him, so that they too might consult Sri Ramakrishna. Vaishnav Charan belonged to the Kartavaja sect of the Vaishnavas. What is Kartavaja? Where we regard God as our Guru. At a place a few miles north of Calcutta, he had a number of devotees of both sexes who practiced sadhana under his guidance. At his request, Sri Ramakrishna visited there a number of times. But the familiarity between the sexes in this sect, the real cause of its degradation, was always repugnant to him. He shuddered at the license prevalent among them and could not reconcile their professions with their actual practice. But even here, there were some sincere devotees, which led him to revise his opinion of this cult. Thenceforth, he concluded that a man, though engaged in some apparently reprehensible form of sadhana, could progress spiritually and ultimately attain to the goal if he only performed it sincerely as a religious practice. As days went on, Vaishnav Charan was so impressed with Sri Ramakrishna's pure character and wonderful spiritual life that he felt no scruple in proclaiming him to be an incarnation of God. A few days after this memorable meeting, Pandit Gauri Kanta Tarkabhushan of Indesh district of Bankura arrived at Dakshineshwar. He was a great sadhaka of the Tantrika school, and every year during the Durga Puja worshipped his own wife as a representation of the mother. He had a strange method of making sacrifice or homa. Instead of arranging the sacrificial faggots on the ground, as is the usual custom, he would pile them, a weight of some 80 pounds, on the palm of his outstretched left hand. Then he would set fire to them with his right hand and hold them in that position till the ceremony was over. Sri Ramakrishna himself saw him do it and used to say it was one of his extraordinary powers. On the arrival of Gauri Pandit at Dakshineshwar, an amusing incident occurred, which Sri Ramakrishna would often narrate to his devotees. Gauri was far famed as a great scholar, and nobody could stand before him in debate. People ascribed this to his miraculous powers. Whenever challenged to a meeting of scholars, he would enter the hall thundering the refrain of a hymn to the Divine Mother, adding some material syllables in order to inspire awe. It is said that this chanting served a twofold purpose, that of unnerving his opponents and awakening a strange power in him. Sri Ramakrishna would say that when he entered in this belligerent manner, it was impossible for anybody to defeat him in argument. Gauri entered the precincts of the Kali temple in the usual fashion. Sri Ramakrishna was seated in his own room and did not know anything about the Pandit's powers. But he was impelled by some power within him to utter the same words as Gauri was intoning, but in a louder voice. At this, the latter raised his voice to a higher pitch, to which the master replied by shouting louder. This competition between the two seemed so like the raid of a gang of dacoits that the guards ran from all sides with their clubs. But to their surprise, they found that it was nothing but a contest between the Pandit and their mad priest as to the respective strength of their lungs. Gauri, not being able to raise his pitch higher than Sri Ramakrishna, had to acknowledge defeat and entered the compound with a silent countenance. Sri Ramakrishna afterwards said that the Divine Mother had transferred to him the great powers which had made Gauri invincible in debate, but which acted at the same time as a barrier to his realization of God. In the course of a few days, Gauri was charmed with the wonderful character of Sri Ramakrishna and surrendered himself wholly to him. A few days after the arrival of Gauri, Mathur convened another assembly of the Pandits, to which, of course, Vaishnav Charan was invited. The object of the meeting was, as before, to test the mental and spiritual state of Sri Ramakrishna by the touchstone of the scriptures. The meeting was to take place in the morning, and the place chosen was the big hall in front of the Kali temple. Seeing that Vaishnav Charan was late in coming, Sri Ramakrishna proceeded towards the appointed place with Gauri. Before taking his seat in the hall, Sri Ramakrishna entered the Kali temple and bowed before the goddess. He was coming out of the temple overwhelmed with emotion when Vaishnav Charan appeared and touched his feet. Sri Ramakrishna at once fell into a trance. A thrill of divine joy passed through Vaishnav Charan's heart, and thinking himself greatly blessed at the holy touch, he began to praise the Master by composing then and there a Sanskrit hymn. The radiant countenance of Sri Ramakrishna and the reverent pose of Vaishnav Charan as he uttered the melodious verses in his exuberance of joy filled everybody with bliss. After a while, the master returned to his normal state and all slowly moved on to the place of meeting. The proceedings commenced. Gauri said, addressing the assembled Pandits, Vaishnav Charan is really fortunate. He has received divine favor today, so I shall not argue with him. Even if I did, I should certainly be defeated. Besides, I find that we both agree on the main issue and have both arrived at the same conclusion regarding Sri Ramakrishna. Any debate, therefore, is superfluous. Not that Gauri was afraid of his opponent's scholarship, but the fact was that he himself had come to feel through his own spiritual insight that Sri Ramakrishna was no ordinary saint. One day, the master, by way of testing him, said, Vaishnav Charan tells everybody that God has incarnated himself in this body. How is it possible? What do you say? Is this all he says about you? Replied Gauri gravely. Then he has said too little. I am firmly convinced that you are that mine of infinite spiritual power, only a small fraction of which appears in the world from time to time in the form of incarnations. Ah, said Sri Ramakrishna with a smile, you seem to outbid him in this matter. What do you find in me which leads you to entertain this idea? I feel it in my heart, replied Gauri, and the scriptures are on my side. I am ready to prove my contention to anybody who challenges me in the matter. Well, it is you who say so, Sri Ramakrishna said like a boy, but believe me, I know nothing about it. Thus, the two great scholars who came to test Sri Ramakrishna ended by surrendering themselves at his feet. This was the first important episode in the life of Sri Ramakrishna since his meeting with the Brambhani. In the swift march of events that followed, it is impossible for us to fix our attention on the more important and deeper currents of thought which left a profound impress on the lives of both Sri Ramakrishna and the Brambhani. The relationship gradually became deep and intimate. Sri Ramakrishna accepted her as one of his gurus and under her guidance practiced a most difficult course of tantrika sadhanas. The spiritual outlook of the Guru herself was considerably broadened, as we shall see, by contact with her wonderful disciple. The thing that comes uppermost to our minds in this connection is the strange fact of his accepting a woman as a guru, happening in the life of a man whose chief advice letter to his devotees may be summed up in the phrase renunciation of woman and wealth, and who seemed to consider the presence of a woman the greatest obstacle to a man in the path of sadhana. This incident is all the more significant and deserves careful consideration. In spite of his warning against association with women, the master accepted one as his spiritual guide and sat at her feet for instruction. He demonstrated thereby that there is nothing innate in a woman that obstructs a man's spiritual progress. Rather, it is the attitude of the man towards her that helps or hinders. If one loves a woman for her physical charms only, she degrades instead of ennobling. But if one looks to the divinity of her nature and sees the mother of the universe manifesting through her, she will help to cut the bonds of matter and show the way to bliss. Woman cannot be shunned, for in this world you cannot escape her. So long as there is the idea of sex, it will follow you everywhere. You can evade it only by regarding woman as mother or sister or daughter, that is, in the purest of relationships. But if you insult her, use her as a toy for pleasure, the nemesis of her wrath will follow you even to the outermost limits of the world. Sri Ramakrishna demonstrated in his life the proper attitude of man towards woman and vice versa, a precious boon to humanity for all time to come. Secondly, from the time of this contact, Sri Ramakrishna's sadhana took a new direction and flowed through new channels. Hitherto, he had tried to realize God without any external help or guidance. He had received no help from the first Guru, Kinnaram Bhattacharya, except at the moment of initiation. By his own tremendous efforts, under the guidance of the ever wakeful teacher concealed in the hearts of all, Sri Ramakrishna had achieved the apparently impossible feat of transcending all the limitations of finite existence and uncovering his true relationship with the one existence, knowledge, bliss. In the compass of a few short years, by his zeal and devotion to God, his renunciation of worldly things, phenomenal perseverance, and unflagging determination, he removed the last barrier of nescience from his mind, and divine truth stood revealed before him in all its purity and splendor. We learn from his sadhana that in attempting to realize the divine, we do not aspire after something new or extraneous. What does not really belong to us can never be ours. By our struggle, we only discover what in reality belongs to us. And for this glorious culmination, the first thing that is needed is zeal. Without this element in the struggle, without tenacity or purpose, no amount of spirituality injected from without, no amount of scriptural knowledge, pilgrimage, association with devotees, prostration, or genuflection will be of any avail. But the idea is too abstract, too high and sublime for the average person. Therefore, we see myriads of scriptures and endless process of sadhana which take the aspirant step by step to the supreme goal. The lives of saints, prophets, and incarnations of God serve only to awaken in our hearts a burning desire to get rid of ignorance. In the person of the Brambhani, Sri Ramakrishna found a living Guru under whose guidance he proceeded, as we shall see later on, along the path marked out by the scriptures to arrive ultimately at the same truth which he had raised before by his own unaided efforts. Thirdly, it is clear from Sri Ramakrishna's meeting with the Brahmani that all necessary help is brought to the sincere soul at the proper time, and if he only fervently prays to God, he is looked after. It teaches us the lesson that all that we require in religious life is to kindle a great zeal for divine realization, and the rest will be added unto us when necessary. Impatience only mars the peace and sweetness of life without helping us in any way. And the last, though not the least, important point about this historic meeting was the correct evaluation of Sri Ramakrishna's personality and his potential greatness. Up to then, everybody had measured the depth of this unique life by the foot rule of his own shallow experience. Even Mathur was no exception. So, while the realizations of the master were being weighed in the balance by incompetent judges, it was the Brahmani who turned the scale overwhelmingly in his favor by her declaration. The matter perhaps would have stopped there had she not challenged the world to disprove her if it could. What the result was, we already know. Thus, the recognition of Sri Ramakrishna's greatness may be said to date from the time of the Brahmani's arrival at Dakshineshwar. It was she who strung together and found a meaning for the hitherto isolated and neglected facts of his life and pointed out their tremendous significance. She was the first to be convinced of his great mission, the role he was to play in the future adjustment of the world's spiritual ideas, and she knew her own part in it too. She set herself to work for the fulfillment of this divine purpose and faithfully contributed her own quota of service towards the unfoldment of this wonderful life. And a word about the man who was suddenly transported by her from a region of ignominy to one of the universal homage. From the opprobrium of supposed lunacy to the supreme honor of avatarhood is a jump sufficiently long to turn the head of any mortal, however sane. But simple child of the Divine Mother as he was, this adoration and praise did not affect him in the least. He kept his gaze fastened on the lotus feet of the Mother and yearned only for her guidance and inspiration. A crown was offered to him, and he set it aside, not like a Caesar, as we see in the play, but actually and definitely. For praise or blame, acceptance or rejection is nothing but a phantom of Maya to him whose mind always soars in the transcendental region of eternal truth. So, my dear friends, today I am stopping here so that next week we will start another chapter, a new chapter in the life of our Master Sri Ramakrishna Paramhansa Dev. Today, Shamata bidding you goodbye. Please be happy, please be safe, please keep praying. And with this, I am saying Shubhamastu.